Hello everyone, this is Joshua Smith of Apollo's Artifacts. It is 2019. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at 4 separate articles about cannibalism. The things that are most notable about this that I really want you to pay attention to are the ways that leftists, whether they are journalists or academics, will engage in various modes of relativism or subjectivism in order to advance whatever cause it is that they happen to be working on. Now, you always have to remember the primary goal for them is always to destroy the pillars of Western civilization. If there is a pillar of Western civilization that you can think of, you will find a leftist or many leftists somewhere hammering away at it, trying to bring it down, trying to destroy it. So if there's some moral tenet or ethical tenet or taboo, you will find a leftist there trying to dismantle it, trying to take it down. They simply cannot stand the notion that history or tradition or religion or anything else has put some kind of barrier in place as a path of resistance against something that they may want to do at some point. They're always looking to make excuses for any type of behavior. So the first one here is republished by Newsweek, and it raised a minor firestorm for maybe a few hours of one day. But I thought it important to go ahead and take a look at it and then to show you that leftists have been making these same kinds of arguments for several years. This is not something that just sprang out overnight. The title of it here is Cannibalism is Common in the Animal Kingdom. Here's Why for Humans It's the Ultimate Taboo. And you can see already that they're trying to enter into one of the modes of relativism here, which is that it's common in the animal kingdom. And this is premised upon the idea that, of course, humans are animals just like any other animal. This is derived from materialism and naturalism, which leads to atheism and secularism, and the view that humans are just like any other animal, and we should not particularly regard ourselves as anything different than any other animal species, because to do so is to commit the major ethical problem of speciesism. That is to favor your own species above other species, which is, of course, very wrong to modern bioethicists. The authors are Jared Piazza and Neil McClatchy. So we have here in the first 3 paragraphs, it says, vulnerable spadefoot tadpoles eat their smaller competitors to speed towards toadhood as quickly as possible. Gulls and pelicans are among bird species that eat hatchlings for food or to prevent the spread of disease. In insect species such as the praying mantis or the Australian redback spider, males offer their bodies as a final gift to females after mating. And these are 2 that come up over and over in these articles, are the praying mantis and various types of spiders. It's more common than you'd think in mammals, too. Many rodent mothers may eat some of their young if they're sick, dead, or too numerous to feed. Bears and lions kill and eat the offspring of adult females to make them more receptive to mating. Chimpanzees sometimes cannibalize unlucky rivals, usually infants, seemingly for the mere opportunity of some extra protein. For humans, though, cannibalism is the ultimate taboo. In fact, our aversion to cannibalism is so strong that consent and ethics count for little. And here, in this final portion, what you see is these 2 authors mix up the concepts of can, should, and ought when it comes to ethics or morality. In one of our own experiments, participants were asked to consider the hypothetical case of a man who gave permission to his friend to eat parts of him once he died of natural causes. Note here that they have no sense of how revolting this is to ordinary people. Participants read that this occurred in a culture that permitted the act, that the act was meant to honor the deceased, and that the flesh was cooked so that there was no chance of disease. Despite this careful description, about half of the participants still insisted that the act was invariably wrong. Now, one Christian response to this potentially would be that this is a sort of defilement of the imago Dei. In other words, humans are made in the image of God, and this is to defile the image of God that He has given us. But of course, if one is just an atheist, materialist, naturalist, well, then there is no such thing as anything happening in an image of God. We are very little different than the praying mantis that you see here, just something else that is born and dies and passes on and goes nowhere hereafter. Even in the starkest of situations, the act of eating another human's flesh remains almost beyond contemplation. Survivors of the famous 1972 Andes plane crash, which they always use this example as well as the Donner Party example, waited until near starvation before succumbing to reason and eating those who had already died. So how is it succumbing to reason to wait until you're almost starving before you would consider eating another human? Would reason suggest that you just start killing other humans early on and eating them so that you don't come to the near starvation point? I'm not sure what the argument they're trying to make here is. That it was unreasonable to not eat one another? Very bizarre. Is that not one survivor, Roberto Canessa, probably a Catholic, I would imagine, felt that to eat his fellow passengers would be stealing their souls and descending towards ultimate indignity. Despite recalling that in the aftermath of the crash, he, like many others, had declared that he would be glad for his body to aid in the communal survival mission. And this is one of the things leftists always try to aim toward also, is this notion of some kind of communal survival that really matters, that one must engage in the ultimate forms of self-sacrifice in order to help the group. And you'll find, too, that when you switch over to economics, for example, this is one of the things that they hinge a lot of their arguments on, is that you can have a so-called redistribution of resources if this communal survival is what is most important. Therefore, they will steal from some to give to others and then pretend that that is moral, despite the fact that it violates one's property ownership rights. It has a section here that's labeled categorical disgust, and it talks here about how many humans have a natural feeling of repulsion or disgust at the very idea. Now, one of the things that you'll find, for example, in Dr. Jonathan Haidt's psychological studies, when he breaks down libertarians versus leftists and people on the political right, what you find is that conservatives or people on the political right have higher levels of repulsion and disgust when directed towards things that are, say, dead or rotting or whatever else, whereas leftists have a much lower response level to such things. So really, these could just be arguments that are manifestations of an internal psychology. And it comes down here, it says, so why our disgust for human flesh but not that of other animals? Philosopher William Irving has us imagine a ranch that raises plump babies for human consumption. I'm sure they'll be working on this, by the way, when they start up all of these programs for cloning, where they make the humanzees and things like that, where they make basically humans that lack the capacity for rational thought, where maybe they don't even have a brain inside their head or something like that. That way they could replicate all of the other parts of the body, and then maybe they'll just farm them out to have people eat them. Soylent Green as people. Much like we fatten and slaughter cattle for beef. Irving suggests that the same arguments we apply to justify the killing of cows also apply to babies. See, this is what you always get from modern philosophers and bioethicists and all this sort of stuff. For example, they wouldn't protest, and they're not capable of rational thought. But here's the problem that he's missing, is that this is a species capacity for humans. There is no species capacity for cows to ever engage in what we would call rational thought. We move down here a little bit. They go through this notion of psychological essentialism. Some of this is born out of Aristotelian philosophy, which a lot of these people really hate, and they can't stand Aristotle, so they try to toss out his philosophy as much as possible. It says here, the way we interact with animals shapes the way we categorize them. Research shows that the more we think of animals as having human properties, that is, as being like us, the more we tend to think they're gross to eat. But again here, what they're missing is that even if in an emergency situation a human decides to eat the corpse of another human in order to live a little bit longer until perhaps they're rescued or something like that, that it's still a traumatic and lamentable situation. You know, it's something that's going to mark them for the rest of their life. They're not just going to shrug their shoulders and be like, well, old Bill was a bit like a burger that I got down at Hardee's or whatever. And also, this is not something that we would really conceive of in an emergency situation as being punishable legally. Next section, adapting to the unfamiliar. Though accusations of cannibalism have often been falsely made to demonize groups, it isn't absent from human history. The Foray people of Papua New Guinea were reported to have participated in funerary cannibalism, believing it better that the body was eaten by people who loved the deceased than by worms and maggots. Parts of mummies were eaten for medicinal purposes in post-Renaissance Europe. I think the Foray people also suffered from kuru, if I recall correctly. They got the brain disease that's a little bit like a spongiform encephalopathy. But I'll point out to you here that notice here what they're trading on, which is another disgust reaction and the emotions of love, right? So they put in this part here where it's like, well, they're eaten by people who love them, therefore that's supposed to get this emotional reaction that it's okay, rather than, dumping them in the ground and having them eaten by worms and maggots, right? So, they're playing on this natural reaction that people say, ugh, gross, worms and maggots? Yeah, it's much better to go ahead and just eat your Aunt Sue rather than throw her in the ground. Coming down here a bit more, thankfully for most of us, there is no need to overcome our repulsion for the foreseeable future. Some philosophers have argued that burying the dead could be wasteful in the context of the fight against world hunger. The fight against world hunger, remember too, these leftists are the same people who are always for population control. They're always saying that there's too many people in the world and that they consume far too many resources. And of course, these same people who talk about third worlders consuming far less resources than we in the first world will also pivot directly around and say that those third worlders all need to come to the first world because of this battle against world hunger. So they're constantly schizophrenic, constantly hypocritical, constantly going back and forth on the issues. It's like they can't make up their minds about what argument they really ultimately want to make. So are population levels too high, or do we need to engage in this fight against world hunger? Which is it? Because once you fight against world hunger, then you're going to have reproduction. And if you look at every other place outside of the first world, they massively out-reproduce peoples who are in the first world. There's no contest, no competition. It's not even close. In fact, much of the first world right now is actually in a regression where they're not even at replacement reproduction levels. Whereas those in the third world are massively, massively beyond replacement levels. And we come here to the final piece where it says, for now, we're as happy as you are to continue accepting the, quote, wisdom of repugnance. Human flesh, despite its biochemical similarities to that of other mammals, shall remain firmly off limits. And the key words here, of course, are for now. And also note the reductionism that they engage in here when they say biochemical similarities. So with an argument like that, you could say that there's very little difference between life and death, even if you go down to a reductivist level below, say, the biochemical level. If you start talking about, say, atoms and molecules, or if you were to examine subatomic structures, you would say, hey, very little difference between a living human and a dead human. Therefore, who cares about killing, right? And if you think this is something that has just come about in woke 2019, you are woefully mistaken. Let's move to the next one here. So this one is from the venerable National Geographic, which you would think is somewhat of a conservative outlet, but has increasingly become wildly left-wing with everything that they put out over the last 10, 15, 20 years. So the title, Cannibalism, the Ultimate Taboo, is surprisingly common. It's a toad-eat-toad, spider-eat-spider, and yes, human-eat-human world. Simon Worrell. This is from 2017. It begins here, of all the screen villains, none is so disturbing as Hannibal Lecter in The Silence of the Lambs. It's not just that he kills people, he also eats them, thus contravening one of our deepest and most ancient taboos, that to consume human flesh is the ultimate betrayal of our humanity. But as zoologist and author Bill Schutt shows in his new book, Cannibalism, A Perfectly Natural History, not all cultures have shared this taboo. See, here we go with the cultural relativism, the anthropological relativism that I referenced to you earlier. In ancient China, for instance, human body parts would appear on imperial menus. When National Geographic caught up with Schutt by phone at his home on Long Island, the author explained how in the animal kingdom cannibalism is extremely common, why mad cow disease and a degenerative brain condition found in the highlands of New Guinea were both caused by cannibalism, and how climate change could trigger mass cannibalism. So here we go with left-wing hysteria about climate change, global warming, and all this sort of nonsense. So somehow this is going to lead to us all eating each other now because climate change. There really is no end to the hysterical threats that they make about climate change. They'll throw in earthquakes, volcanoes, anything that you can imagine, hurricanes, tornadoes, Your neighbor looked at you funny. It's climate change, And what do we see here? Right out the gates, once again, spiders and praying mantises used as the examples. The spadefoot toads are mentioned again here, just like they are in the 2019 article that I mentioned before. And they jump right into climate hysteria. Once again, in this paragraph, it says, for instance, spadefoot toads in the American Southwest lay their eggs in transient ponds, some no larger than puddles. Because of the climate, these ponds are in danger of drying up at any moment. Have you been to the American Southwest? I have. It is extremely hot and dry. And if you have a transient pond, right, transient by definition means it comes and it goes, and it's no larger than a puddle, of course it can dry up rapidly in the heat of the American Southwest. My goodness gracious. I'll move down here a bit, and it says, sensational instances of cannibalism in the West, like New York City's cannibal cop, always hit the headlines. Why are we so drawn to the idea of people eating each other? Since Homer and the Greeks, we have been taught that cannibalism is the ultimate taboo. That continues from Homer through the Romans to Shakespeare, the Brothers Grimm, Daniel Defoe, and Freud. You had this snowball effect where we were taught that cannibalism is this horror. If you combine this ultimate taboo with our fascination with food, what you get is a fascination with the topic. And this is just rank amateur psychologizing. This guy's just engaging in pure guesswork. And it's kind of interesting here, too, that he... you won't really find the leftists pointing this out, but the pagan Romans often accused the early Christians of being cannibals. That was one of their prime charges against them. And of course, the Romans had very few of the moral structures that would come along from Christianity later. I mean, they would engage in the use of abortifacients with no problem. They would engage in abortion with no problem. They would engage in infanticide, where they would abandon a child on the side of the road if it were ill or had some deformity or whatever else, and then maybe they would be picked up and brought into slavery later, because they also had no problem with that. But more often than not, the child would just die at the roadside. The next one here is the suspicion of cannibalism was used by the West to justify conquest, particularly in the New World. Explain how that worked. Now, I'll point out here that this was just one tiny piece of the argumentation that was used by Westerners to justify coming over to the New World. When Columbus first arrived in the New World, he described the indigenous people as friendly and causing no problems. He had been told by Queen Isabella to treat these people with respect and kindness, except if it became clear they are cannibals, in which case all bets are off. Initially, the Spanish were looking for gold, and when they didn't find it, they figured that the next best thing was slaves. This is not exactly true. This is a massive distortion here. Actually, most of the people there ended up getting illnesses and dying. They weren't just brought right into slavery. That's not true. Lo and behold, when Columbus came back, the indigenous people who had been previously classified as friendly were suddenly described as cannibals, so you could do anything to them. This is not true once again. What they thought that they were, there was a huge argument actually, biologically as to whether or not they were actually humans, but once they did make the determination that they would go ahead and call them humans, they said that they were gentes sin razón, meaning humans who lack the capacity for reason. So it wasn't simply that they thought that they ate one another, possibly. It was that they couldn't engage in reasoning in the same way that the Europeans could. So you could enslave them, take their land, murder them, and treat them like pestilence. And that's exactly what happened, with the result that a lot of the islands were depopulated. The idea of cannibalism as a taboo was used to dehumanize the people encountered in these conquests. Now, this is a very common trope that they try to play in this whole thing about the conquistador period. What they ignore is that there are a number of different anthropologists who have actually found that there was some kind of disease already ravaging many of these populations. And no one has really been able to determine exactly what that was, but it has been speculated that whatever these diseases were killing millions of people who were indigenous already, both on the mainland and on islands. And in this, these thumbnail sketches, you never get that sort of thing brought out. It's always just told like, well, the Europeans came over and gave them all a bunch of diseases and killed them all and all that kind of stuff, and that's the end of the story. But that's not really the whole picture. That's not true, in fact. It's not accurate. And in the next section, you're going to see more of the cultural relativism that I've mentioned before. Cannibalism is a taboo in nearly every culture, but not in China. Tell us about the history of gourmet cannibalism and how Mao unleashed a new wave of famine-driven cannibalism during the Cultural Revolution. And keep this in mind when you see the leftists praising communist China today, that this is the sort of stuff that went on. And also, I would point out here that ancient Chinese emperors would often drink mercury and wear clothing made out of asbestos. So if you're going to praise the gourmet cannibalism that they had, you may also want to get yourself a jacket made out of asbestos and see how that does for you, and then drink you some mercury. Not actual medical advice, of course. During the Cultural Revolution, privately owned farms were collectivized. These techniques did not work, though, which resulted in a lot of people starving. Oh, really? They didn't work? You mean stealing people's property from them ends up with really bad results? Many people across China were reduced to incidents of what is known as starvation cannibalism, similar to the Donner Party. Families were often reduced to trading their children for the children of their neighbors, so they wouldn't wind up killing and eating their own kids. So they'll just kill and eat somebody else's kids because of the wonders and joys of communism. China is a special case because it was never exposed to the taboo against cannibalism. This is a Western taboo. If your culture dictates that if you're an emperor, you're allowed to eat human body parts, then there's nothing wrong with that. There are numerous descriptions of emperors and other members of the imperial court enjoying humans as a type of food prepared in all different ways. And I'm going to skip some of these other sections just for brevity. We come down to this part. Cannibalism can also cause havoc in the food chain, can it? Tell us about mad cow disease and its connection to a condition in New Guinea named kuru. And here he touches on what they skipped in the first article that I mentioned. One of the seriously negative aspects of cannibalism is that there are cannibalism-associated diseases like kuru and mad cow disease. These are degenerative brain disorders, are always fatal, and come from eating nervous tissue that is infected with either prions, if you go for the prion theory. And I don't really think prions are a theory anymore. They are real. They're malfolded proteins, and you can actually see them under a microscope. Or some as yet unidentified virus. So it could be both, though. There is a possibility for that out there as well. Both of these arguments are strong, and I don't think that this has been decided. There are other diseases like scrapie, which you find in sheep, and a spongiform encephalopathy in mink that do the same thing. In the cattle industry, they started to feed ground up entrails from other cows to cattle as a protein supplement. This is what led to this outbreak of mad cow disease, so on and so forth. This same type of disease almost wiped out an indigenous group in New Guinea called the Foray. When the scientists went in and started to study this, they realized that what they were seeing in the brains of these kuru victims was very similar to the effects of mad cow disease. Over the course of about nearly 2 decades, they put together the theory that funerary cannibalism among the Foray, especially kids and women who were involved in the preparation of the corpses and cannibalizing body parts, including the brain, was causing this horrible disease. Once they got it out to them that this was probably not a good thing to be doing and laws were passed against eating their dead brethren, the disease was curtailed and the Foray did not become extinct. These spongiform encephalopathies serve as a negative selection pressure against cannibalism. You don't say. And then, of course, he jumps into something that leftists and the National Geographic and basically any history course or anthropology course or anything else you're running into nowadays try to promote the idea of being panicked about climate change and global warming, so on and so forth, because I guess we'll all end up eating one another. And now we come to yet another venerable institution, the Smithsonian. Europe's hypocritical history of cannibalism, from prehistory to the present, with many episodes in between. The region has a surprisingly meaty history of humans eating humans. This is from 2013, written by Sarah Everts. And in this one, notable is that you won't hear very much about the loss of human dignity. You won't notice very many things about how dehumanizing it is to eat other humans. You also get a heaping dose of social construct theories and moral subjectivism. And I'll just read a bit here from the beginning. In 2001, a lonely computer technician living in the countryside in northern Germany advertised online for a well-built man willing to participate in a mutually satisfying sexual act. Armin Mue's notice was similar to many others on the internet, except for a rather important detail. The requested man must be willing to be killed and eaten. Mewis didn't have to look far. 230 miles away in Berlin, an engineer called Bernd Brandis agreed to travel to Mewis' farmhouse. There, a gory video later found by police documented Brandis' consensual participation in the deadly dinner. The cannibalism was both a shock to the German public and a conundrum to German prosecutors wanting to charge Mewis with a crime. Cannibalism might be humanity's most sacred taboo, but consent of a victim typically eliminates a crime, explains Emilia Musumeci, criminologist at the University of Catania in Italy, who studies cannibalism and serial killers. More technically, cannibalism is not designated as illegal in Germany's extensive criminal code. Until that point, laws against murder had sufficed to cover cannibalism. If Brandis had volunteered his own life, how could Mewis be accused of murder? Because of his victim's consent, Mewis was initially found guilty of something akin to assisted suicide and sentenced to 8 years in jail. Had there not been widespread uproar about the seemingly lenient penalty, Mewis would be out of jail by now. So I guess that's what they want, is this person to be out amongst civil society. Instead, the uproar led to a subsequent retrial where Mewis was found guilty of killing for sexual pleasure. He will likely spend the rest of his life in jail, to which I say, thank goodness. I don't want this guy out around the public, around kids for sure. It's completely demented. The next big section of the article just goes through sort of making light of the whole matter, talking about Dracula drinking blood and zombies and all of this other sort of stuff, as if that's somehow comparable. And then we get another dose of the relativism here by hearkening back to 100,000-year-old bones, where they talk about, and we have old fossil evidence for cannibalism, that Neanderthal, for example, fought against other Neanderthals and sometimes ate one another. Or Cro-Magnon perhaps attacked Neanderthal and ate them, or vice versa. And this is a pretty long article overall. I'll have all of these linked below, of course. But I'm going to point out something here to you that has come up, of course, again and again. They talk about the 1972 plane crash in the Andes. And here's where they are engaging in what I call the ethics of emergencies, or reasoning from the margins, or arguing from the margins. One such category is survival cannibalism, where people consume each other out of absolute necessity, such as the 16 survivors of a 1972 plane crash in the Andes Mountains, or the members of Sir John Franklin's failed 1845 expedition to the Arctic. And one of the big errors here that you find in ethics and morality are when people make these arguments from the ethics of emergency. So you're in this dire situation. Your only option is, in order to continue living, you eat parts of the corpse of someone else who's already passed away. But then they reason from that to say, well, see, it's not a very big deal in general or overall. And that's where the problem comes in, is that you're arguing from a specific situation where the ordinary tenets of ethics would not apply, and then trying to make some kind of a generalized statement about that. That's a huge problem, and it comes up in ethics all the time. Another category is mortuary cannibalism, the consumption of the dead during their funeral rites, practiced through the 20th century in the Eastern Highlands, province of Papua New Guinea, and the Brazilian and Peruvian Amazon. Quote, "This is not, as we may instinctively imagine, morbid and repulsive," notes the University of Manchester's Sarah Louise Flowers in her conference abstract, "but is instead an act of affection and respect for the dead person, as well as being a means of helping survivors to cope with their grief." Can you imagine this in your own situation? Oh, how we all just loved old Uncle Jack. Can you pass me one of his fingers? Granny, slow down eating his thigh. You're going to get choked like when Cousin Jenny got hung up on that fence and the wolves got at her. And the final paragraph here with the talk titles like Flesh Eaters in London, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, Bon Appetit, A Concise Defense of Cannibalism. One can only hope that the conference canapes are vegetarian. And now we come to the final article from 2007 from The Week, called Cannibalism, Our Man-Eating Past, by, I guess, just the staff in general. And they recount rather familiar territory by now. They talk about Columbus coming over, calling the Caribbean people Cannibes, which is where you get the Cannibalis name, which is how you derive cannibalism. And here they talk about an idea related to cannibalism and how it changed over time within the field of anthropology. Haven't such travelers' tales been discredited? They were for a time. In 1979, anthropologist William Ahrens published The Man-Eating Myth, in which he argued that stories of cannibalism were racist lies, because that's what leftists say about everything that they don't like. So Here, this guy was taking up the lefty position that, everybody who's to the right of him is horrible, evil, racist if they criticize anybody that happens to be different than them. Historically, he pointed out communities that are considered threatening or inferior have often been described as cannibalistic. The Romans accused the Celts of eating people. The English accused the Irish. Stories of cannibalism among African tribes eased the consciences of European slave traders. They argued that they were doing the Africans a favor by rescuing them from such depraved activities. In 1503, after the Spanish crown decreed that only cannibalistic tribes in America could be enslaved, man-eating natives were suddenly discovered all over the New World. Aaron's thesis that cannibalism was a fiction invented to justify Western colonialism proved highly influential, ushering in a period of cannibal denial among anthropologists. So, of course, once the evidence started to stack up against the cannibal denialism, then they had to turn around and start defending cannibalism and making up ideas as to why it's actually pretty cool and good and not really that bad, which is where you get this outpouring of the other 3 articles that I've shown you. Are they still in denial? No. Recent scientific discoveries have proved beyond a doubt that cannibalism was once commonplace. So then those Europeans were not such horrible racist liars then, were they? Is there archaeological evidence? Plenty. Human myoglobin in a protein found only in human muscle tissue has been discovered in the 1,000-year-old feces. Plenty. Human myoglobin in a protein found only in human muscle tissue has been discovered in the 1,000-year-old feces of Anasazi people, ancestors of today's Pueblo Indians. At the same sites in the southwest, archaeologists found human bones that had been boiled in a pot until they were polished smooth, and skulls that had been roasted face up over a fire. Caches of butchered human remains have also been discovered in France, Spain, and Britain. Some of the British remains date from between 30 BC and AD 130, around the time of the Roman invasion, suggesting that the Romans had a point. The Celts did eat people after all. And it wasn't just the Romans who brought in this idea that cannibalism was bad, but the Christians after that as well. Why would anyone eat humans? In many cultures, endo-cannibalism, eating one's deceased relatives, was a mark of respect for the dead. The Fijians ate their vanquished enemies in a spirit of reverence. The Aztecs, on the other hand, captured their enemies in order to sacrifice them to the gods. The prisoners were led, one by one, to the sacrificial altar. The priest would cut open the chest cavity, first peeling back the skin and then sawing through the sternum and ribs, all while the victim was still conscious. The heart was pulled out and held aloft, still beating before the cheering crowd, and then cooked and eaten. Each prisoner represented one of the gods. Eating him brought the participant closer to the deity. But see, these were the kinds of things that were going on in the Americas. All of the Native American tribal groups were fighting one another, killing one another, constantly taking one another's land from each other. And so when the Europeans came, really it was just a continuation of the exact same process, which is a human process that has been going on ever since humans existed. So to turn around and try to act like this is some kind of a specifically European evil is just pure nonsense. We move down here to a section on modern cannibalism. Survival cannibalism still goes on wherever there are severe shortages in food. In North Korea, where a series of poor harvests and a big cut in international aid have brought the population to the brink of starvation, there have been reports of children being killed and eaten. These are the joys of communism once again rearing its ugly head. Just as it did under Mao, it's the same thing in North Korea. Pieces of special meat are displayed on straw mats for sale, said one North Korean refugee recently. People know where they come from, but they don't talk about it. In war-torn Congo, Lindu and Hema militiamen have been cooking human hearts and livers under the eyes of UN observers. But in summation here, I think you see the point that I'm driving at, that the leftists have been making these kinds of arguments for a long time. 2007 there, 2013 here, 2017 here, and reiterated once again in 2019. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Thank you.